All right, so I left my Wacom tablet at home and I'm charged with talking about the Phillips curve. So I decided to bring this little whiteboard into my office and do it old school. So the Phillips curve is something that I don't know if you're familiar with. I don't know if you've been taught it. If you have not been taught it, I might treat this as optional. If you have been taught it, it might really help you with your projects and especially your inflation lesson plan. But basically, with the Phillips curve, right here we have inflation. Here we have unemployment. So inflation and unemployment. And the three main aspects of the Phillips curve is that in the short run, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And supply shocks, aggregate supply shocks, can cause both to get worse. I'm going to start with this long run one here. Okay, long run Phillips curve. So the long run Phillips curve is a vertical line, and that vertical line is at the natural rate of unemployment. Now I'm going to put 4% here. So the natural rate of unemployment, it's equal to frictional plus structural unemployment. And basically, it's what the economy is always going to return to in the long run. So it's a function of potential output, which is the best our economy can do given its labor markets and resources. 4% is the best we can do. If we try to push unemployment below 4%, we're going to get inflation. So the fact that this is vertical is like, hey, whatever the inflation rate is, whatever happens, we're kind of stuck here. And for those of you that are familiar with like the historical, I guess, arguments between neoclassical economists and Keynesians, this is a neoclassical concept. This is like a Milton Friedman concept. All right. So there we go. Now we're going to bring in the Keynesian concept, which is the short run Phillips curve. So basically this says that in the short run there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Specifically, if unemployment goes too low, inflation will increase. By the way, I'm going to put 2% here. So 2% is our target inflation rate. It's what our Federal Reserve says is going to be the target, although it's changing a little, and you'll read in one of the articles. But we're going to put that here. So basically, if unemployment goes to, say, 3.5%, this shows that inflation is going to increase. Now, this is a positive demand shock. This can be caused by many things. The stock market doing well, the housing market doing well, optimism of businesses, optimism of consumers. Oh my gosh, there's so much stuff. But basically what I'm arguing here is that and I'm not the only one arguing this, is that the stimulus bill, specifically the third stimulus bill, the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill in April 2021, the American Rescue Plan, I believe it was called, was designed with the wrong natural rate in mind. So that's basically what I'm arguing. So we head into COVID, we had 3.5% unemployment. I remember I was teaching, I said, hey, this is the best labor market. You're graduating into the best labor market, congrats, right? And then COVID hit and it all got messed up, as you know, from last week. So we had this 3.5% unemployment rate in our heads. And by we, I mean policymakers. And so the people that were designing the stimulus bill were assuming a 3.5% natural rate of unemployment, right? So basically they're like, oh, this number here is 3.5%. So what happened was, we were actually over here. Unemployment was super high, or I think it was, 6% maybe as that stimulus bill was passed. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. And basically what happened is the stimulus bill was trying to get us back to the natural rate. But they thought the natural rate was 3.5%, when really it was probably like 4. And there's all these reasons for it. People permanently dropped out of the labor force, all of this stuff. And so basically what happened is they overshot the stimulus. Okay, so we end up with inflation. And now this is demand pull inflation because it's driven by aggregate demand pulling it up. So the thing that caused it to increase was government spending, increase in government spending, decrease in taxes, increase in transfers. Transfers is like the stimulus payments we got, or the child tax credit. So basically, the policymakers had the old, wrong natural rate in their minds, and they overshot that stimulus. Now, I'd love to say that back in April of 2021, I was like, I knew that was going to happen. I didn't know. No one had any idea, right? But when I attended the American Economic Association conference, and basically they found the three people that had predicted the inflation, and they asked, what happened. They said, well, our models were wrong. One of the guys who presented, who actually argued this, was an advisor to President Obama. And so I would imagine he was quite sympathetic to the Biden administration. And he was like, hey, the models were wrong. So that's one thing. And I realize now that I don't have a good eraser on me, or an eraser on me. The other thing that I believe if you took Professor Devaraj's class, you would have learned, is that the shape of the Phillips curve is more vertical than we thought. So basically they were like, the Phillips curve is kind of like nonlinear. Okay. And so what happens is when unemployment was super high, we didn't get like the drops in inflation that we normally see. It was kind of like stuck. Like inflation was stuck for a while. But then we go below the natural rate and it's like, boom, we get crazy high inflation. And in fact, the article calls this the linear part. So you can say that's linear. So basically it's like, wow, we thought if we went below the natural rate, we'd see inflation, but we didn't realize it would be this extreme. And so that's an argument that's made as well. So that's the Phillips curve explanation. Basically, we, overshot that stimulus. We saw higher inflation than we might have predicted. And, to President Biden's credit, I remember him saying this because people said, it's too big, it's too big. And I remember him saying, I know it might be too big. I would rather it be too big than too small. So he was vice president during the stimulus package of 2009, and he says, I watched this recessionary gap happen until like 2015. I would rather overshoot a stimulus than undershoot it. So it's interesting, right? He was kind of aware that might have been too big, but thought, well, it's worth it anyway. The other thing that happened, of course, is we had supply shocks in the middle of this. So aggregate supply shock, there's two of them. The first is the supply chain issues, which we've talked about. Computer chips, we can't get those, we can't get all this stuff. By the way, if you look at the Q1 GDP numbers, which came out last week, and there was a 17% increase in imports, which drove down GDP. I think what's happening is those supply chain issues, some of them are finally starting to ease, and we've got like pent-up demand, and we just import crazy amounts of stuff. Supply chain issues caused this to shift up, and then, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused this to shift up. To be honest with you, though, gas prices were up before that anyway. So we've got like increased oil, gas prices, supply chain issues. Basically, it's like, hey, we've gone into demand pull inflation territory, but on top of it, we've got all these things. So we've got even higher inflation than the simple trade-off would